8:22 exactly. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. And we kick off with our first interview for the morning with Riefdah Ajam. She is the Federation of Unions General Secretary to talk to us about the alarmingly high unemployment rate in South Africa. It's sitting at 34.4%, supposedly one of the highest unemployment rates in the entire world. Worrisome indeed. Let's unpack that, understand why it's happening, and can this be turned around? Riefdah, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the program.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah, and shukran so much for the opportunity, first and foremostly.
Lovely to have you here. And gosh, this is truly doom and gloom, is it not?
It absolutely is. And when we take into account just the statement that you've made, the most alarming figures that we have ever seen in South Africa, historic highs at this stage. And what certainly has to be emphasized and impressed on is the fact that women once again remain the biggest losers in this game. So most certainly intervention is necessitated as a matter of absolute urgency. And the government, together with social partners and stakeholders, have to start walking the talk when it comes to women and empowerment.
Very sadly, Black women are the most at risk here, aren't they? They're the ones who are suffering all the time, and yet they are supposedly, in lots of instances, the heads of households.
Absolutely. It's shockingly scary that we take a look at inequalities first and foremostly, and we take a look at the dangerous reputation that South Africa continues to hold, that it remains the most unequal society in the world. So surely things need to be done, and they need to be done with absolute determination, firstly, with absolute commitment, and any form of fear or favor. So most certainly when we take a look at that grouping, and in the context of the pandemic, we note that they've always been the ones to make the most sacrifices when we take into account that women continue to be caregivers, continue to take up the responsibilities in the households, and for that reason have literally withdrawn from the labor market. Hence, we are seeing the contribution towards these factors.
Now, two things jump up at me, Riefdah. The one is our education system. Are we preparing our youth adequately enough to enter the job market? Whatever skill sets they do have, are they educated or upskilled enough in the school system to be entering the job market, number one? And number two, let's look at our employment or our employment conditions of employment in terms of hiring and firing. How conducive are those conditions in terms of hiring people and keeping them meaningfully employed?
That's a very good question. Shukran for that one. I think it's important for us to understand the dynamics here when we speak about education in particular, and most certainly we are a far shot off from where we have to be. Number one, we are dealing with the pandemic once again. Unfortunately, it has been the first ever historical global pandemic of such a nature that has literally ravished things for not only women and children, but in terms of South Africa, where we stood with a 29.1% unemployment rate at the time that the pandemic had hit South Africa. Now, when we take into account education in particular, we most certainly are nowhere where we need to be. There's a skills mismatch. We have already entered the fourth and the fifth industrial revolution, and at the same time, we are not adequately prepared because of the inaccessibility and because of the affordability, most importantly, the inaffordability of data, which has become the order of the day now in terms of children teaching and learning and the ability to be able to engage meaningfully. So many of the learners, once again, are facing challenges with catch up, with being able to to plug into so many elements that it becomes an absolute challenge. So unless we are prepared to engage and to invest heavily into our education system, then only we are going to be able to see some of the better advances that we need to make. But until such time that that mismatch of skills is still there, especially in terms of the technological advances, we are going to stay on a back foot. So that's the first one. From FEDUSA's perspective in particular, we have taken a resolution at one of our collective bargaining conferences and leadership sessions to say that training, upskilling and reskilling must form an integral part of all forms of training within the workplace, which brings me to the second part of your question in terms of hiring and firing and the landscape. So essentially, we are trying to forge cooperatives. We are trying to ensure that there's greater understanding and collaboration in the workplace relationship, because once again, going back to the pandemic, we have seen not only anxiety setting in, but pre-traumatic stress, which has been one of the psychological impacts of this pandemic, which have seen people fearing going into a workplace where there are inadequate health and safety mechanisms, which we are addressing once again. But at the same time now, taking into account how things are developing in terms of the current situation in South Africa, it is taking a lot more engagement, considering the new directive where workplaces or some of them are going to be declared mandatory in terms of the new return to work protocols and also in terms of the vaccine rollouts.
Okay, how much did we, what sort of a knock has employment taken regarding the recent riots? Is that just a short-term situation? Can we recover from that? Will we recover from that? How do we move forward? We know that the pandemic has really created a huge challenge for young people going forward into finding meaningful employment. But the recent riots, is that just a temporary thing which we will overcome?
Ma'am, it's very sad. The attempted insurrection in Gauteng as well as in KZN has only just started to agitate a situation that was already fiery. High unemployment, inequality, inaccessibility to education and training. So unless the government really starts implementing the plans, the first one of them being the immediate response to the pandemic, the economic recovery and reconstruction plan, and equally so many of the other employment generating initiatives, we are going to be struggling with these kind of attempts for still a very long time. We've seen schools being burnt down, infrastructure being damaged, to the tune of approximately 15 billion that was damaged here. So how do we begin to recover when you look at Durban, for example, many family-owned businesses there that simply cannot recover from what has happened here now? And even though there are intervention measures in place, how effective are they going to be able to address these things? We know that the Minister of Employment and Labour has extended the TERS to respond to this matter here, but the uptake thereof is going to be absolutely important. And even though we have intervened by assisting to identify companies and businesses in the communities and elsewhere, the trust relations there, once again, in terms of the state's ability to effectively intervene, has been something that has been raised continuously. So it's going to be a lot of hard work for us to do. And it's very sad to think that the contributors towards economic development, i.e. SMMEs and small businesses, whether or not they'll be able to get to their feet effectively is another story. And once again, knowing that Durban, that only has one season, summer and summer, how we bring back the issue with regards to tourism, domestic tourism, when we are still dealing with many facets of the pandemic.
Okay, final two questions is Britain, for example, has just released some stats stating that there's a wage disparity between men and women. And we're talking about a first world country, and that's the UK. And that wage disparity runs in double digit figures. I think it's sitting somewhere ridiculously high in the 70%, 70%. What does it say for us here in South Africa in terms of wage disparity between men and women? That has to close. How are we going to go about doing that, and how do we move forward from this? A couple of years ago, government introduced the National Youth Development Program and a whole host of programs. I wonder if that was successful. Did it take off? Did it create employment, much needed employment for the youth?
There are so many programs that government has initiated or attempted to drive in order to tackle youth employment, which is part of those stats that were released yesterday. But the ability to take it to the next level, sometimes we have to take a look at that social compact that was formed during the height of the pandemic, and we really have to review the intensity of trying to make these things work. You mentioned just one of them. There's the YES program. There is the employment tax initiative. So many of these initiatives being put in place, but the determination and the commitment by all is something that really has to be looked at extensively. And once again, we are finding graduates who are unable to find work, and at the same time, those with experience being unable to engage effectively. So the crux of the matter, we look at Britain from the onset or the inference of your question, but what about South Africa, and equally so in the global space? We are finding that as much as we are making attempts to address this, the onus is once again, or the burden of proof lies on the individual to be able to justify or show and prove that, there are disparities in the system. And if we are not going to address this by virtue of the Employment Equity Commission, by virtue of the legislation in particular, and equally so by using the mechanisms through the CCMA to address these matters, we are never going to be able to get to the bottom of the matter. So it is up to companies. The employment equity legislation has made some moves and some steps in the right direction, but it is still very far from where we would want to see this going. But we are continuously pushing the barriers to ensure that women, not only in leadership, but women in all tiers of governance, gets the acknowledgement and gets what they deserve. Because ultimately, we are never going to be breaking that glass ceiling if we are only going to talk about it, but we are not going to effectively implement it. So there requires some strict review in terms of where we should be in order to get to that equalization factor.
Riefdah, that's where we have to leave it. Thank you indeed for your input on this matter. Worrying indeed. We wonder what the future is going to look like for our young leaders. We hope and pray that government, business leaders, corporates, etc., come together, put their heads together, and start thinking about how we can revive the economy here in the country. Shukran very much for your time. Salaam alaikum to you.
Walaikum salam. Shukran so much for the opportunity.
That was Riefdah Ajam. She is the General Secretary of FEDUSA, talking to us about the shockingly high unemployment rate right here in South Africa. It's exactly 8:36.